Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Bill of Rights Institute's 10th period webinar series. My name is Kirk Higgins, and I'm joined this week again by my colleagues Rachel and Gary. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, good to see you.
I'm Rachel Davison-Humphreys, Director of Outreach here at the Bill of Rights Institute.
And I'm Gary Coletti, Senior Manager of Programs.
And so this week we wanted to continue what we talked about a couple weeks ago, which is just thinking about creative ways that we're approaching thinking about education, what education really means. And we really wanted to open up the doors and invite all of you into a conversation so that we can think through some creative approaches towards teaching and how it is that we're thinking about it and how it is we've dealt with some different approaches in some of our Bill of Rights Institute's lessons and also in our own classrooms when we're classroom teachers. So we're excited to talk to you about that today. And as I said, we really want to hear from you in that conversation. And so if you want to comment on Facebook, that's great. And we also, I think it's facebook.com/BR Institute or on Twitter at our Twitter handle, which Rachel can remind me of, or down in the comment box below. So, but to just get things going, we were talking about this, I think last week, kind of formally amongst ourselves, thinking about just fun things that we really loved doing in the classroom. And Gary had some really cool and innovative approaches, I think, to a few different things that he was doing in the classroom that really got us thinking about DBQs in different ways. And so, Gary, do you want to show us what you got?
Absolutely, yes. And DBQs, you know, they are just fun to toy with. DBQs, I was always a huge fan of DBQs, as possibly you are, because they balance two big things, right? There is the part where you're encouraging students to collect information from all over and sort it and make something out of it, which in itself is super cool to do. And then there's the you're creating something at the end of it that's very clear. And not that other activities don't, but I always thought there was a real elegance and beauty to DBQs. So you're right, as we were talking about it, you know, I think the powerful thing that I also encourage you out there to either comment or ask questions about is that doesn't have to stop right now, that those activities, adapting them and the art of adapting them is kind of a fun thing you might do whether or not this situation we're happening. It might be something you've already been doing in classes, but it might be something that continues these days. So yeah, I'd love to talk about some things that we do with DBQs that go beyond just publishing them. So I'd like to refer to one that we have. In particular,
I know that as you're pulling that up, Gary. So the APUSH test was a single DBQ this year, which was new for a lot of students. So a lot of the APUSH teachers were always doing DBQs as part of their pedagogical practices, but there was this extra focus on DBQs for a lot of those who are especially interested in APUSH and had their kids testing. And DBQs, you know, there's a bit of a love-hate, I think, for the students sometimes with DBQs. What do you think, Gary?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think a lot of that is when the output of the DBQ is always the kind of the bulk writing for them often is what turns them off. I found, and I don't know what you all have experienced, but I found that the process of putting together wasn't as onerous or they didn't chuck at it as much as they did when it came to the writing part, even though they had done all the work for it. So I think that's where some of that interesting adaptation comes, is still doing a DBQ, but maybe the output is something else. So you probably experienced this too when you were teaching, but the idea that one of the mantras or one of the phrases that came up a lot is when you're doing an activity, there's the have to and get to part, right? That there's something that they have to do, and then there's what they get to do. So in this example, I want to pull up Mapp v. Ohio from 1961. This is a lesson that we have under resources. If you want to check this out, this is under our Supreme Court DBQs that we have. And you'll notice that the title of it is part of the bigger idea, which is the rights of the accused. So already kind of places it in a bigger concept. So if the have to for students is to focus on this particular court case, and the get to is how do they interpret it and how do they How do they convey it? So just a real quick kind of background to everybody on this particular lesson, if you're not familiar with it. Not that you're not familiar with the case, but our lesson on it. We give background and we go into founding principles, backgrounds of the case. It's a really nice way to encourage that confidence for yourself. You know, whether or not I was not a legal scholar exactly, but there's enough here that I could kind of, you know, be aware of what was happening. And then there's this key question, right? To assess the claim that the exclusionary rule helps ensure liberty and justice, a big meaty thing for students to chew on. And so that's the have to part, right? They have to do this assessment. But how they go about it is really interesting. So the way we present it is we've got a lot of materials that we have presented for students to take a look at, some of which go back to 1761 or the 1914. These are different years. They're not all just this one case. But in leading the students through the handouts, doing the collection and organization is really, really powerful. And so I'm going to show that the way that students organize it can be used for lots of different ways. You want to look at, you know, what was an argument on one side versus another, because it is a court case. There's a ruling, there is dissent, and this is something that we do ourselves around BRI. If they've organized that output, I often would give them a choice to say, you could do a traditional writing, which is
you can do a couple of paragraphs. You can say what your opinion is. Use the evidence that you found.
Exactly.
Agree or dissent with the majority or minority opinions. There are lots of ways you can get that out of them, right?
Exactly. And with a good, you know, graphic organizer, that thing could be really useful. Right. So then what I often would do is say, you can do that or have some other choices. For example, your graphic organizer can turn into a cartoon. So this is my example. This is based entirely, and I'm not
guys, don't look too closely.
Don't look too closely at this. My handwriting and details of
we're very busy.
The people on there very specious. But this is all entirely based on what I showed you. Yeah. That you can tell not only the narrative of the story, but also include those documents. So again, don't look too closely. I did make Wolf a wolf. That is, you know, artistic license on that one. But I think students, in saying, I've organized the thoughts, if this reads straight through and not only honors the narrative of what happened to Dolly Mapp and others involved in this scenario, but also the decisions that were made, they're still conveying that information in a really creative way.
Right.
Additionally, you can take the same organizational style as well as the same idea of cartooning and breaking it up and make a storyboard out of it. So this is again, that's a stick figure in the middle, totally fine for the less artistic students out there. But it helps students see, like, if we're tackling Mapp v. Ohio, and a key idea of what you're teaching is we really want to talk about the Fourth Amendment, we want to talk about the 14th Amendment. It helps them kind of see, like, how would they convey it to others? Because I do truly believe, as a teacher, that the best way to learn something is to teach somebody else. And so I always encourage students to do that. And so if they start with what are the lesson objectives, and again, don't read too closely, imagine these are my lesson objectives at the bottom, then what is being seen and conveyed and what is being said? And it's still being written. But if they can visualize what it would look like, then this storyboard is a really interesting way for kids to think, how can I teach it clearly and not just regurgitate information? How can I process all these different things and allow them to express it? And to be perfectly honest, this could turn into a video that you could do by Zoom or something like that. So, you know, we around the office are starting to produce more like that, and we do work these things out. In fact, I would check out some of the homework help videos. Now, this didn't turn into that, but those homework help videos started similarly with outlines and details and things that we all put together. Well, really, Kirk and the content team put together. That are now really interesting, digestible things that anybody can check out. And
we'll make sure that the playlist to our Supreme Court homework help videos is in the comment section and in the chat for you to take a look at. And we're getting lots of comments from the teachers. So I just want to highlight a few of them that, like, yeah, one of the things to think about, again, is kind of, we talk a lot about motivation and intrinsic motivation, but what's authentically interesting to students? especially now that you're trying to overcome a lot of other barriers, that authentic interest and that real, that philosophical difficulty that comes from civil rights kind of cases are really powerful, especially as there are a lot of questions about civil and individual and civic rights right now. You can map that onto things happening in the news. What are our rights in this time? That's a video we did a couple of weeks ago on our bright and early student-facing series. If you're not familiar with that, we'll get you a link to that too. But Karen was mentioning that she has used that, and Stacy was saying that she has students bring their own DBQs to a topic, which can be very helpful.
Well, and I really like that idea too. And just touching again on our homework help videos that we put together, what we try to do is present the Supreme Court case as a story, because fundamentally that's what it is, right? It is a story that unfolded where the justices decided for one case. But that's not to say it's the only way that it could have been decided. And I think the reason I really like the students coming up with their own DBQs is it puts them in a position where instead of having to memorize just what happened, they're really investing in figuring out what took place and how they can come up with that argument. So that gets to that intrinsic motivation. It's not just something that's being impressed upon them, but it's a conversation that they are then a part of, which I think is really powerful.
Yeah, no, exactly. And as Stacy and Leslie, and I'm glancing through some of the comments here, are saying, it's the action that students take in creating one means they have to have some sort of curiosity about this topic, know the paths to follow, like say a detective would, and say, what are the threads? But then once they've found this information, a document in a DBQ is not going to be the whole thing, right? So that also how do they excerpt, how do they pick out the important parts? These are really key skills that are had, again, not because it is, as you said, impressed upon them, but rather something that they are able to pursue and then craft themselves and share, which I think is really powerful.
And I think what I also really like about that is, and I'm going to talk about it in a little bit, that there's a bit of Zoom fatigue right now, and getting them to use other modalities is really hard right now, right? Because everything, you have to turn things in online, you have to be online. So how can we help them kind of stretch those other faculties and give them the opportunity to do things that aren't online for a little while? So there are online cartoon generators where you can go in and do it that way. There are online storyboarding, but having that physical version where they actually have to write it out and I mean, there's something powerful there, and then take a photo, and then you have a gallery of all the photos of all the cool things the kids have done. What were you going to say, Gary?
I'm chuckling. There are online versions. Why did I do this? But no, that's exactly true. And exactly like you're saying, that I think some teachers use the term asynchronous or offline. That's a really rich thing that students will want to do offline, because as you said, it gives them the chance to, there's something about the tactile creation of it. Exactly right. So I'm smiling because that's exactly right. Like even the assumption that it's still going to be digital, it doesn't have to be. Right. And all those times in between checking in, what fun it is to learn in those individual times when you're creating this. I'm not gonna lie, I had a good time.
And that's what Lauren is saying, that with the smartphones, the students can already begin taking those to the next level, right? The stop, they can do mini stop motions, they can use objects in their house. There are all sorts of things they can do that extend and deepen the learning opportunity in that extension work. That again just kind of breaks up the monotony of being online all the time that they're getting right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And harnessing the kind of comfort level students have, again, with giving them the options for multiple ways to present stuff is really interesting. Again, you mentioned
what differentiation is.
Exactly. It's built-in differentiation. I see, again, what Warren was saying in terms of filling it with props. I'm thinking like, my brother would do it with claymation if he could. Or Leslie mentions like the idea of almost political cartooning. Now, students are very good at stringing together memes and imagery in a way that really talks to other young people in ways that make a lot of sense.
That reminds me,
thinking of these ideas like that are powerful.
One of my favorite lessons, you can find it online, is having students design a Funko Pop for a historical figure and a historical period. Like I saw one of my favorite ones that I've ever seen, and we're going to touch on Hubris later on. But one of the favorite ones I ever saw was they did They did the captains of industry or robber barons. So you had to decide whether you were going to portray them as a captain of industry or a robber baron. And some students chose to like do like a two-faced thing, and it was a very, very cool. You can find them online. There are a couple of versions of it, but it was a very cool activity.
And you can design your own. I did a similar thing where every unit this shows my age, but every unit was sort of a trading card thing like Pokemon. So every time they learned a new person, and again in the curriculum, so you have a nice list ahead of time. You know exactly who the main ones that are in the curriculum to touch with, but you would give them exactly like you said, sort of details about their lives throughout the year, as well as, you know, little data points. And then by the end of the year, they would review. They have big decks that they were reviewing and playing with in terms of like, you know, leadership, George Washington versus, you know, a king of England, something. And they were just voluntarily doing this because they had a big deck they've been working on the whole year rather than in one assignment. So I think that's a great idea.
Well, I think that gets at too, and I really like your framing of need to, get to, Gary, because I think this touches on it. I mean, one thing we think about a lot at the Bill of Rights Institute are sort of macro principles that unite a lot of our conversations. And I think the need to thing, and that meaty question you talked about in the DBQ gets at that central question that is a pattern that comes up in other places, right? So the exclusionary rule isn't just another thing you need to know. It is in the case of Mapp v. Ohio, and knowing that context is really important. But it's also, why is it a big deal? And that's where I think helping students to start to identify patterns and see things in different areas is another way I think that you can kind of creatively begin to address these lessons. And we do this in our Heroes and Villains curriculum, which I'm going to pull up really quickly. And this was the hubris that Rachel was talking about. I think I'm going to pull it up. It's hiding on me. I've been having strange things happening with Zoom lately.
I think, well, I'm going to talk about this later. We are in week 10. So, right. You know, our technology, like our love of our technology is maybe starting to wane a little.
Yeah, absolutely. So our Heroes and Villains curriculum, for anyone who may not be aware, is a curriculum that the Bill of Rights Institute put together that investigates different civic virtues or habits that are exemplified by different historical figures. So in this case, we looked at Douglas MacArthur, and that Douglas MacArthur, in this particular instance that we investigate, exuded some hubris. The incident that we investigate in this lesson is his near invasion of China during the Korean War. He overextended the U.S. forces into North Korea. They were then attacked by the Chinese and nearly completely overwhelmed. And he was relieved of command by Harry Truman, the president at the time, because he was in a contentious relationship where he was actually combative with the president of the United States, who is his boss, or was at the time. So really quickly, I just want to point out a couple things too. If you're unfamiliar with the Bill of Rights Institute's resources page, our resources page is home to all of these curricula. And we have another site too that makes this all a little bit more accessible that I think we'll be sharing the link for. But resources.billofrightsinstitute.org will bring you here. And we've got we've got these 12 curricula called out, which are sort of what we see sometimes as our greatest hits. But we also have 139 narratives in our American Portrait series and some additional resources. But this is our Heroes and Villains page. And then on each one of these lessons, for every one that we have, there is a button right here that downloads the entire lesson.
Nice.
That is a very good button. Show me that button again. Can you show me that button again?
I can. It is,
great.
As you scroll down, it's right here.
Yay.
It does, and we saw this on Gary's too. Each of the individual elements is also here along with resources, but this button is your best friend. And it will download the entirety of a lesson. And so in this lesson, we go through, again, a central question. And this one, again, is really grappling with MacArthur himself, who contributed a lot to United States history, even though he had this sort of tragic ending, sort of. It wasn't too tragic. He was still hailed as a hero. But it goes down and it goes through his story and this particular incident. And then it talks about what we're talking about when we're talking about hubris, which is this idea of having excessive self-pride or vanity, arrogance that leads to a tragic fall. Which is something that we can all learn from, right? And particularly in these trying times, as we're having our public leaders have a very significant role in each of our lives during this period. I think it is certainly something worth contemplating. And it goes through and it gives, it's got a great primary source activity here as well, which is his part of an excerpt of his address to Congress in 1951 after he had been called home. But what I really wanted to call our attention to was this section that we have across Heroes and Villains, which is this virtues across the curriculum. And it is sort of an interdisciplinary thing, but it also kind of breaks out of, I guess, tradition, unless you have a film department, maybe at your high school, maybe you do. But here, I think, and this was, I believe, written by Tony Williams, who we feature occasionally here on 10th Period. But he called out Tony Stark as a great example of an individual character that students may be very well aware of because of the Marvel Cinematic Universe that's been very big lately, and gives a great example of what hubris looked like in that film. So connecting, again, this big principle of what is this habit that we're wanting to be mindful of and identify, and then showing a pop culture. I don't know how pop culture Iron Man 2 came out in 2010 anymore. But you can take these and adapt it too. And so even when we were talking beforehand, we have a few other examples here. The Iliad and Paradise Lost, maybe things that your students are already talking about in literature or English language arts classes, which can be great to pull in. But also we were talking about other works of literature that students may be reading on their own. I noted, and Gary and I disagreed about Boromir in Lord of the Rings as a character who I think who I think exhibited hubris in that instance. But being able to talk about that, or encouraging your students to find something that they're passionate about that may then call out one of these elements that you're talking about. So maybe it would be another instance where they're looking for something about the exclusionary rule while they were watching Law and Order or something, you know. But I think finding those ways of pulling in some asynchronous activity for students and having them go out and just be creative in how it is they're thinking about and approaching these things is another facet that we can use to approach some of these big topics.
No, exactly. When you were showing that big question at the top about the can a hero, I'm trying to remember now, it's can a hero fall? What was the question again? Can a hero sometimes fall because of the character flaw related to pride? I immediately was thinking of the power of, and you said interdisciplinary, right? That phrase could just as much be in an English language arts class or a literature class as it could be in a history class. And it's worth thinking in those terms of the fact that if you're saying to a student, you know, think of this book, it may not be a book that you taught, but you know that they did learn in their class or a movie that they did see. And again, you're right, of the vast library of Marvel movies, I don't know, Iron Man 2 is the first one that comes to mind.
Well, but, I mean, you can let's bring it forward then. Well, the last movie, talk about hubris.
Yes, but the character, right? The character is something extremely familiar to students,
right? And
to think there's an arc of this person and their narrative. It's a fictional character, been around for decades, but a fictional character. It necessarily enables students to think about what do we mean about the concept of hubris and humility, and the fact that these virtues and vices are throughout time when it comes to the narratives we have. And I think it was really interesting to balance that. You mentioned Douglas MacArthur, a human being, you can track their actions, and a fictional character whose actions was created for various reasons. And yet there's this through line of their actions, almost the not motif is the right word, but sort of the category of personality that's there.
There's a reason that it's a trope, right? There's a reason that it's a common element in storytelling.
Right.
And this is, again, when you look at theories of history, which are very sometimes overlap heavily with theories of literature and character development and the rhetorical tools, using classical tropes like the tragic fall of a hero exists because it maps onto something true about human experience. That's right. The reason it speaks to us is because we can see it in the world. And I love that Leslie, thank you for loving this lesson. It's one of our favorite lessons. And that's something all teachers do anyway, which is this tying the distant historical example with more modern examples, or with fictional examples that are closer to the student's experience, right? I would use the most recent Spider-Man as a really interesting heroic hubris arc, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
That moment in Homecoming where he is crestfallen because of he like tried to go after this guy by himself, which was hubristic, and then literally the building falls on top of him.
Yeah.
So, what's that?
Yeah.
Oh,
No,
spoiler. Sorry. The movie's like 6 years old now. Aren't I allowed
I think he's okay.
about
I think
it?
Spider-Man is okay.
We'll put a spoiler in the thing. Spoiler, Spider-Man.
I think that's true. And we had the example of the Iliad on there as well, right? And thinking about Achilles and his fall. I think that is amazing that work was written thousands of years ago. And here we find that same characteristic that human beings are wrestling with about how to do it. And that's the other thing I think that I really love about our Heroes and Villains curriculum. And it can be in any other curriculum, but that curriculum in particular allows room for disagreement over whether or not the individuals are exhibiting that trait, which is good. Because that is part of identifying what's actually taking place there. It's a gray thing, right? It's up for interpretation. Yeah. So I know Rachel's favorite is John Brown.
John Brown.
Is John Brown working? He's working toward a good end, but is he doing so in a bad not the best way possible?
Well, and so what this does is this creates a foil. It creates a proxy conversation where students can practice the habits of dialectic and dialogical, democratic virtues that you want them to cultivate as future citizens. But it gives them the distance from current events to be able to cultivate those abilities, those skills, and those dispositions while not miring them in what's currently happening. But once they've demonstrated their ability to do that, then you can start to have those conversations about what the governor said or the mayor said or the president said yesterday, right? So that's the pedagogical framework that this allows for is that kind of direct preparation for citizenship and those kinds of conversations that are so important in our history curriculum, but gives them the space to do that in a more protected, way.
Right. And another thing that Heroes and Villains does throughout each one of them, one of the approaches I think is really powerful and interesting is it makes them very human, because it makes it about choices that were made, right? So in Heroes and Villains, that title sounds a lot more static than the actual curricula are, right?
Because they all are. It's the question: are they heroes or villains?
Right. And spoiler again, it's not. These people are not in one category or another fully, but it's the choices that were made. So that reminds me similarly of, and again, something you do with fictional characters, but with historical characters, is decision points and then counterfactuals. Right. So what would have happened had some other choice been made. And that was something we did all the time. If I can share real fast. So we would do this with games in two different ways. Almost every unit we had some kind of game. And one of my favorites was to adapt a board game called Diplomacy, which is also a really good way for students to learn geography. Because the way that the board game is set up is all of these basically game pieces or game areas are actual locations, some of which are more industrialized than others. And immediately students had to sort of understand in order to win, and spoiler, there's no real winning when it comes to this, but to think about, these different factors about how you use data. They would have to use data of, France at a certain time versus Italy in terms of its population, its industry, and so forth. But then they had choice points. And again, I keep joking about spoilers, but what students would have to do when they did games like this is to make choices. And I would actually introduce it before giving too much background, because they found that they made the choices that ancestors and others did prior to us. And they understood why they made the choices, rather than looking back and saying, this person did this for some mysterious reason and this other thing happened. They say, oh, here's why this happened. And so the counterfactual idea went along with other games we did, which was stealing from the 1980s series, but Time Machine. So you would take a historical event, cut it up into pieces, and then at decision points being made by historical figures, you can spec out what would have happened had someone made a different decision. And students would love this because they would say, like, what if at this point in history, this other decision that could have been made by somebody happened, and see how the dominoes felt. And you would find that if you travel through history that way, they loved saying, you know, had this thing happened or not happened on this given day, how much would be different? And I think that their mindsets are great. And then they would create games and scenarios like that themselves. So it was actually very cool.
Yeah, and a quick plug on that point. So the Bill of Rights Institute in July is going to be launching a new U.S. history resource called Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And it's a full U.S. history resource that covers from 1491 to the present, and is also aligned to the College Board's AP US History standards. And we're really excited about it. There's a preview course available now. If you want to find out more about it,
go to our website. If you go to our website, we'll put the link in the comments section for you or in the chat. If you just go to our website, we have a landing page. You can sign up to get on the list for early access.
And like all BRI resources, it's at no cost. And it's been in partnership with a group called OpenStax of Rice University. So we're really excited about it. But the reason I bring it up is because one of the components in each of the chapters are several decision points. Right. And so where we've highlighted a moment where a decision was made. And it's not to go into counterfactual history or anything else. It's just to reinforce the fact that history is made up of decisions of individuals. In certain situations, in certain contexts, a choice was made. It could have gone differently, but it's interesting to zero in on those moments because they are really powerful. One we bring up quite often is Washington at Newburgh, right? And he's approached by his generals to basically become a monarch. And he sets that aside and says, no, I'm not going to do that. I am going to remain devoted to the cause of the revolution and pursue this Republican form of government. And those are really powerful moments, I think, for us to wrestle with students.
They also, the other wonderful thing in that is the point counterpoints.
That's right.
Which does something similar, where it says there are two ways to look at this moment.
Yeah.
There was a decision that was made. Here's what one side thinks about that decision. Here's what another side thinks about that decision.
Yeah, they're really about historical moments, right? So we'll have two scholars, two different historians from two different institutions write about their interpretation of a singular event. So the New Deal, for example, what does historian A think? What does historian B think? They show their evidence, they write their argument, they each write about a 500 word essay, and then it allows students to really engage in those discussions too and see history again as a conversation that's being entered into, not just as something that is being memorized. Which again gets to that intrinsic motivation, that idea that their learning is a part of this. They're learning to better engage with that thing that is happening, not just something that's being sort of thrust upon them.
Well, I have one more thing I'd like to talk about. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Please.
Firstly, it is our penultimate 10th period of the season.
Yeah.
We've been doing this all season long. So for those of you that have come to our live sessions, we're so glad you're here. They've kind of evolved as the needs of our community have evolved, and we'd love to hear feedback from you about which ones you really enjoyed and what we can do better. But I want to check in with you guys on this second to last 10th period. How are they going for you? What have you enjoyed about these 10th period webinars?
You mean us or the audience as well?
No, you actually, Kirk and Gary. You've been on a bunch of them. Kirk's been on all of them.
Okay. But I also want to welcome those who have been watching.
On the internet too.
Or those who have been doing other video things, but yes.
Yeah, and I'll say I just enjoyed going through different topics and trying to think through things in a variety of ways. I've really enjoyed doing the close readings that we did earlier in the year, getting an up-close look at particularly primary sources and sort of diving into those and picking those apart and finding fun and interesting tidbits to work on, but also I think pivoting and trying to work and serve our educator community as best as we can. I hope we've been successful in that. It's been a challenge, as I know it has been for everyone, trying to figure out the best way to continue to approach the education the things that we want to accomplish, it's a challenge, especially when there's a lot going on in our personal lives outside of this that are stressful and uncertain. And so it's been an interesting time, but I've really enjoyed doing them this season.
Yeah, as an every time watcher and not super frequent, guest, but sometimes I've been invited on, which I've been very honored by. I love that it's not just one thing. So as a viewer, I like to be able to tune in and say, I do love close readings, but I also love when you have guests with other teachers. I also love when you have scholars. And the fact that there's always something kind of new but familiar to everyone, if that makes any sense. And there's a great comfort to that. I will also echo Warren that when there is an interplay, is the word he used, or discussions going on from teachers, and knowing that the viewers out there are having a live experience and sharing not only with you, but also with each other. That's super cool and lively, because teaching really is, to me, a very energetic, dynamic, fun thing.
Right.
And that's why webinars are such a great idea, because it's not a dispensation of information to you, but rather it is this real dialogue, and it's super cool to watch and sometimes type in.
Well, and I think the last thing I want to just really touch on very quickly is that there's a lot going on for educators right now when it comes to online platforms, and Zoom especially. There's a bit, not just for our students, but for us, of Zoom fatigue, because we're so used to the energy of the audience, of our students, to the sidebar conversations that happen, before class and after class, that we get so much joy out of. And so I just wanted to take a few moments for us to just think about, what may be happening with all these Zoom calls, and how we can help our students continue to feel the energy of our teaching practice through this mediated experience. So this, I'm showing you the original article, but what I'd like to put you through is this nice little, Carleton University put together a nice little slideshow, just talking a little bit about why Zooming is so exhausting. And the first thing, and again, adolescents are always doing this anyway, but it's harder to process nonverbal cues. It's harder to know if I'm looking at Gary or Kirk, right? It's harder to know just what everyone's thinking, because I can't get that secondary nonverbal information. And there's a bit of a delay. So Gary starts to talk and starts to, is that right? And so that's an additional stress. Okay, no, go ahead. That's an additional stress on the communication, even if everyone is coming with their best energy, and that's not happening, right? And so the other thing that's happening is silence makes us anxious, that there's a problem with our technology. As all good educators know, the silence that we try and cultivate is something precious, because they're so uncomfortable with it. Like, getting them to a place where they're okay with silence is an important moment in the dynamics of the class. That when there's a bit of silence here, we're always asking, is this a real silence? Are people like thinking through things, or is this a problem with my technology, right? The other thing is that adolescents always think they're being watched. They have that like observer problem where they are always paying attention to them. But now everyone can see each other all the time, right? You don't have people behind you or in front of you. You're all on the screen all the time. But then you also can see yourself, which that's like the most uncomfortable thing for adolescents, to have to watch themselves all the time. It's hard for me as an adult. I did, I put on my blazer and my makeup today for you all, because I was like, I'm going to be on the screen with other people, right? But it's even more for the adolescents. And then this is a little bit what Stacy is mentioning and what Leslie's mentioning, is that it's a little bit melancholy and bittersweet that we're on Zoom, because yes, we're still having some experience together, but it's so different from what we usually have together. Aspects of our lives that used to be separate are now all happening in the same place. So, you feel a little bit more vulnerable to, like, if you had a bad call, now you're in another call and you didn't move physical spaces, right? If something happened in a class that wasn't as great, now you don't like get up and like shed that when you walk through the next door frame. It's still with you. And so that's something to consider. And it all feels like an obligation, right? It's all performative because we're all on screen all the time. So the question is, how can we make it better? And that was part of the impetus for this conversation, is what can we do to change it up, to make it dynamic, which is something you do in your classes all the time. But when we get into this modality of always being online, it's becomes kind of singular that everything has to be online. So trying to remember that you can do these other things like the cartooning or like movie watching or things that are not as performative. And then also the last thing is the checking in on people's well-being. You have such an important place in the life of your students. And even more so now when they have this really uncertain experience that is, I don't like the word unprecedented, but it's unprecedented in our lifetimes. And that makes your role in their lives all the more precious. And so really taking the time to have those one-on-one connections. Lois is mentioning, or Leslie is mentioning the breakout rooms. I had the opportunity to run an online Zoom session with people that I care deeply about. And I would go into those breakout rooms and check in with the groups, right? Because you can, as the leader, when you make the breakout room, then you can go in and chat with them. But I also want to encourage people to make sure that when you're in those conversations, you have that one-on-one connection, even mediated through the technology, because you're a stabilizing force in their lives, and a lot of their lives are unlike what they thought they would be and what they were 6 months ago. And so it's a precious thing, and there's lots of pressures on us, and some of us are starting our school years late, some of us are ending our school years early, some of us are starting our school years super early. Looking at you, Kansas. And so this is not going away. There's a lot of work to be done, but we're so grateful that you spend a little bit of your time working with us and letting us be with you. So thank you for all that, and I hope that was a little bit helpful, because I think as we're thinking about what Zoom life looks like in the next 6 months, adapting our teaching practices to meet the social emotional needs in addition to the academic needs becomes all the more important.
No, absolutely. And again, I love this conversation. Lois saying that she wanted to talk about Zoom fatigue, and Michelle saying that, thinking in terms of synchronous versus asynchronous. When you're in a classroom, you're in class, and when you're not in class, it's pretty clear. But now the learning is very fluid. And Karen checking in by, saying that we still have the connection, even if it's seemingly on something else. And I mean, I'll just pipe in again, when I think about the approach in the classroom, part of you're talking about social emotional learning. Part of the comfort I found my students had was that they know I planned things out, right? And they know that I was on top of stuff, and everything that happened in the classroom was well thought out. And of course, we all know we did not plan for a global pandemic. And we also did not know, and in many ways still don't know, how long it is. And so there's a lot of patience that's happening with this, planning things out. If you knew it was going to be a month, it would be a thing, right? But if you don't exactly know, it's amazing how clearly, I'm getting misty here. The teachers I know can express they got it. You know what I mean? And they can be on top of stuff. But that could be a lot of pressure too. And it's amazing that people are saying, you know what, even if I don't know what tomorrow looks like, or next week, or next month, or we still got it. And it's so important that the students see that, because they do, but also building that together. So it's, I want to give a shout out that I don't have answers for everybody, because everybody else has been tackling it, and everybody watching has been tackling it, and they really got it.
They do.
Well, and I just want to say, I really appreciate, Karen, Michelle, Daniel, everybody that's sharing their ideas. I mean, I think that's one of the most powerful things that we can do right now, is come together as a community and share these experiences. And I hope, if nothing else, that these webinars at least serve as a platform to be able to share some of those ideas and get in touch with others who are going through a similar circumstance, or are battling similar challenges as we all are going through this, just challenging and uncertain time. And we'll be here. That much I know.
That is true. We're not going anywhere. So
yeah, and to circle back to the theme, so much of what I've experienced watching your webinars and seeing what everybody's writing, if I may say, harkens back to one of the first things, which is there's the have to, right? We have to connect, we have to do these things. Then there's the get to part, right? And so much, these students who sometimes they're not coming because they have to, that they get to, and they want to connect with all of you, and they want to learn this stuff. And it's a really interesting balance of those things. Is there's a strange opening to still the get to, and to say, to be creative, it's not, yeah, there's the pressure to, I got to rethink how I teach to do it online. But then there's also the but what do we get to do? And we really get to do these things that we love talking about. And so that balance is still there, even though it looks completely different.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it underscores the importance of the work that all of you are engaging in. And that is the idea of figuring out what it means to be a human being, figuring out what it is to navigate and understand the world that's around us. That is the work of education and becoming educated. And it's something that we're all engaged in as human beings. It's a really powerful thing. It's a really difficult thing, but it's one that I'm glad that we at least have the technology that enables us to do so in a pseudo-synchronous, is that a word? I'm going to pretend that it is.
Sure.
Sure.
Pseudo-synchronous way. And the Bill of Rights Institute will continue to be here, as I mentioned. If you continue to have questions, if there's things that we can help you out with, please do let us know.
We're on all the social medias.
We're on all the social medias. We will be continuing.
TikTok. We haven't done that yet.
Not TikTok. And I don't think we have a MySpace page anymore, but we will continue to do some limited programming over the summer as far as what our online presence will be.
So make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, because we're actually going to be prepping some online things that you can use in the fall. Close readings, lectures, those sorts of things. So make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. You'll get updates about all of those things. And of course, you're already on our emails if you found us here. So
that's right.
And I think that's really important, is that we do work through the summer, right? Even though we said that this webinar season, that always happens. We always change seasons. Our summer season's all about planning for the fall. So the lights don't go out. We're still doing, it's just different things because the seasons change.
And our next seminar, our last one, is with the president of the Bill of Rights Institute, Dr. David Bobb, and we encourage you to come join us for that and bring your friends. We'll talk about what the future of civic education looks like in the now.
That's right. We're looking forward to that conversation with David, and we're looking forward to seeing you there. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.